So, as I said, welcome to this evening's lecture. The lecture this evening is being given to us by Olaf Kirchner, who is going to talk to us about Orford Ness. I'm not going to say anything more because he's got a fantastic presentation that he's going to give to us. So I'm going to hand straight over to him and let him get this underway. So Olaf, if you would like to share your screen, please.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation. I'm very, very pleased to be able to share a journey on Orford Ness with you this evening. The presentation that I'm going to give you this evening, it was in fact given to the Boscombe Down Aviation Collection by David Warren, who is also participating in tonight's call in February. So if anyone of you have seen that one, this will be very much the same. So I hope you're not too disappointed. It will be in fact in two parts because of the mechanics of the presentation limits on the iPad that I'm using. So I'll go through the first half of the slides and then I'll come to a halt and I'll just put the second one on. Should only take a few seconds to do that. So let me start then by telling you a little bit. The presentation is going to be obviously a virtual visit to Orford Ness. Orford Ness has an awful lot to offer, so I can only really touch on the land itself, the Orford Ness environment, and all the activities that were going on there. And the idea is really to give you a flavour of what has been going on there and what is going on there. Hopefully, for you to come and see much more details on our website, and also hopefully, if you're in the area, to come and visit it. So this is by no means any kind of encompassing presentation about what went on in Orford Ness. It is simply impossible because so much happened. So we'll be looking at the Orford Ness itself, about some military trials that were held there in almost 6 decades. And in particular about some of the research that Irgon has been doing, which I'll come to in a minute. Orford Ness is currently is owned by the National Trust, and we just wanted to be sure that the National Trust and Irgon, we are independent and we don't speak on their behalf. We have our priorities and they have theirs. But obviously, the people working on in Irgon are also active on the Orford Ness, and in fact 5 of them are actually volunteer rangers who show people around the Orford Ness site, including David. So just to give you an idea then, Orford Ness is Europe's largest vegetated shingle spit. It's basically a huge long line of shingle and other environments stretching to the east of Ipswich, stretching on the eastern coast of Suffolk. It is about a mile at its widest point. It's, as you can see, 10 miles long, and it is in fact technically joined to the mainland just south of Aldeburgh. It is only about 200 feet wide, the narrowest point. So to all intents and purposes, it's an island, even though it's really, it's technically a peninsula. The site itself was bought by the Ministry of Defence in 1913, and in 1915, it became a military research site, initially looking at performance of aircraft and associated weapons at the time. There were 2 airfields built there, and a lot of the work done there was highly secret. And of course, the remote location of Orford Ness helped in providing the secrecy needed really for all of the 6 years that the site was a military site. The last trials run on Orford Ness were Cobra Mist, which was a US designed over-the-horizon radar. And when that was closed in 1973, that essentially meant the end of military activities on the Ness. So where is it exactly? Well, for those of you familiar with the coast of Suffolk. It is, as I say, to the east of Ipswich. It's this long, narrow spit of land. The middle part of it, across from Orford, is really where most of the activities were happening, but it does stretch for a long distance southwestwards, all the way to a place called North Weir Point, and we'll look at that in a moment. The western border of the Ness is defined by a river that originates near Snape, which originally is called the Ald. It almost flows into the sea near Aldeburgh, and then it suddenly turns left and it runs along in parallel. It also changes its name to the River Orr and finally flows into the sea opposite a little place called Shingle Street, and thus defines the western edge of the Ness. Currently, as I said, the Orford Ness is mostly owned by the National Trust, as you can see in green on the drawing on the right there. Parts of it are owned by Copper Mist Limited, which have been using the sites of the former secret over the horizon radar site. And there's also a small part that was owned by the Lighthouse Trust when the lighthouse existed. I don't know if it still is, but we'll get to that in a moment. Here's a visitor's map of Orford Ness, and this gives you a good idea of the variety of natural environments on the Ness. So on the seaward side, you have really shingle, which is a loose collection of gravel and flint, similar to what you might find, as somebody already mentioned, on Dungeness. There is a ditch called Stony Ditch, which is a tidal creek that fills up at high tide. And then to the landward side is marshland. At one point, the airfields were built on that marshland, and it is now been allowed to go back to nature again. And then, as I said before, you have the River Orr, which defines the landward side of Orford Ness. So here's a nice aerial view of Orford Ness looking southwards. So you see Orford village there on the right. You see the River Orr with all the ships on it, the two former airfields, Stony Ditch. You also see a really interesting pattern of these parallel lines on the shingle side. And these were in the past the shorelines that has moved seaward and landward again with time. Orford Ness has been of different size and shape it changes over decades. And right now the phase is of the sea encroaching on the coast of the Ness, but it could equally well be going the other way in a few decades. It changes all the time. Most of the military activities, in fact, took place in the area that's in the photograph here. So you can see some buildings on the shingle side, and you can see the airfield and a few more things, which I'll get to in a moment. Looking at Orford Ness in the other direction, here you see the southwest point called North Weir Point of the spit, called North Weir because if you approach the Orford Ness from the south and you want to head up the River Orr, this is where you need to weir north, basically. Otherwise, you miss the entrance. Orford Ness used to have a rather beautiful lighthouse. It was built in 1792, and it has always been a very visual point of reference on the Ness. For a long time, it was the only building on the Ness, and until the military arrived, there was really grazing of animals, sheep on the salt marsh. There wasn't much other activity. Very unfortunately, the lighthouse had to be demolished in 2020 because the sea was encroaching on it and it was in danger of falling into the sea, which would have been a tragedy. So what was done was it was demolished, and the top part of it, the lighthouse itself, was preserved as a museum exhibit. So you'll unfortunately no longer find the lighthouse there. Here's another picture of the lighthouse looking north. As it says here, it was actually decommissioned in 2013, and its job was taken over by Southwold Lighthouse. Southwold is a few miles to the north of Aldeburgh, and was demolished in 2020. Wildlife on Orford Ness is very specialized. Not only was one of the effects of the military occupation of the Ness was that there was no tourism, and so a lot of wildlife established itself. There are also a number of different habitats. There is salt marshes, there's the shingle, there's the regular marshes, and so there's all kinds of habitats which led to many animals living there that don't live anywhere else. Personally, it's easy to see when you visited the site. You see brown hares running around. I've not actually seen a marsh harrier, but or indeed a Chinese water deer. Avocets are around. There are many animals, and indeed plants, very specialized plants for these specialized environments. Unfortunately, I'm no plant expert, so if some of you know a little bit more about plants, they'll know how special these plants are. But let me turn to some of the military activities on Orford Ness, because that's probably of more direct interest to you tonight. So, like I said, in 1913, the military purchased the Orford Ness, and it was used by the RFC for various experiments until the end of the war. There was a bit of a hiatus until about 1924, when the war had finished, and really there was very little activity. Things are mothballed. And then activity started again when the airfield became an outstation for the aircraft and armaments experimental establishment in Martlesham Heath. Martlesham Heath is about 10 miles, it's just outside Woodbridge. And in fact, Martlesham Heath was the main airfield from which aircraft operated really all through the life of Orford Ness as a military station until it was closed. There was initial radar experiments done by Watson Watt, which is an entire history in its own, which I'm not going to go into any further. And then, of course, when the Second World War started, Orford Ness airfield was closed down. The area was fitted with anti-invasion, anti-glider devices so that nobody could land there. And in fact, the airfield never opened again. So all aircraft operating over the Ness from 1939 onwards were based at other airfields in other parts of Suffolk. So the RAF left, and the Royal Aircraft Establishment then left in 1959. But between 53 and 67, in the Cold War, the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment arrived on Orford Ness. And that is an entirely new, separate history of activities that went on there. When the AWE left in 1971, yet another program was established, also completely new on Orford Ness, called Cobra Mist. And Cobra Mist was an over-the-horizon radar, built at huge expense, operational for about for a couple of years, and then eventually was closed down for various reasons, some of which are still secret, I suspect. And in fact, at that point, activities on Orford Ness were abandoned. Between 1967 and 85, there was a lot of clearing of unexploded ordnance on Orford Ness. And then finally, when the Foreign and Commonwealth Office took it over, the Orford Ness was finally acquired by the National Trust in 1993. Open to the public in 1995, and now we can all go there and visit it. So here are some of the major buildings on Orford Ness. if you read about Orford Ness online, if you visit it, if you look at maps, it is extremely confusing because there are a large number of buildings, some remnants, some better, some less well preserved on Orford Ness. And what you've got to realize really is because of its location and because of the fact that it was a military secret site, Orford Ness was almost like a business park. There were many, many activities going on, some in parallel, dealing with all kinds of programs, which were not necessarily related to one another, and some of which we are still discovering about even now. One example is I was personally involved in a program to document the history of bomb ballistics testing on Orford Ness, and I'll briefly mention that later. While doing that, I got contacted by somebody who said that some of the markers and some of the features on Orford Ness were because it was used as a regular practice bombing site. And my initial response was, no, you don't understand. It was a special ballistics testing site. Turns out both were correct. Both activities went on in parallel, and there's probably more that we don't know about. So if you find Orford Ness confusing in the buildings and the times that the events and activities happened, it's just because there was a lot of different activities going on, sometimes in parallel. So I won't go into any great detail about the items on this particular map, just for you to realize that there are several larger and many, many smaller buildings, some well preserved. There's of course the lighthouse there. There are roads, mainly concrete roads, that link some of these, and those concrete roads were built later on in the 50s and 60s. Before then, the only way to move around on Orford Ness was a narrow gauge railway that was built and then taken away again. So again, complicated history. Right, so this is a little bit of a timeline of some of the programs. I already referred to some. In the starting in World War I and going on until the late 50s, there was really developments of aircraft, offensive, defensive technologies, photo reconnaissance. There was also a very interesting program, which some of you may have heard about. It's called the lethality vulnerability testing. The idea there was, it was started in the Second World War, and it was really, how can we get an idea about what kind of battle damage would on average, statistically speaking, what kind of battle damage would bring down an aircraft and would not allow it to return. So aircraft, both British aircraft and also Axis aircraft, were assembled in Orford Ness, and they were shot at. And they were wanted to see just what kind of damage would be caused, what would be survivable, and what would not be survivable. In parallel, there was also a statistical study about what aircraft had returned from sorties and what kind of damage they had suffered. And it turns out that, of course, the battle damage that was significant was the fact the battle damage that was never seen on aircraft returning because they didn't return. And so the offshoot of all of these testings and all of these trials was to improve the protection of the crew and of the engines, because that was really what would lead to an aircraft on average not returning home. The bomb ballistics I already mentioned. So there's about 30 years of testing of unguided weapons. Dropping bombs from a moving aircraft is incredibly complicated, and the accuracy of bomb deliveries across the Second World War was, on the whole, pretty dismal. So there was a lot of research needed to improve the accuracy of bombing, and that is certainly, that was a very important activity on the Ness. Radar was also a development that started on Orford Ness. The early development of Chain Home by the team led by Watson Watch was run from a building called the Black Beacon on Orford Ness. We are not actually covering this in Irgon because there's just too many other things to talk about, and it's actually already fairly well documented. There are at least 3 individual, separate, sequential over-the-horizon radar programs, which I'll mention a little bit later on. And of course, the activities that led to the really these really special and unusual buildings that you can still see on Orford Ness now, these famous pagodas, was the weapons stress testing that was done on nuclear weapons in the mid-50s to mid-60s. Again, I'll talk about those a little bit more in detail later. So, in fact, let me start with this stress testing of nuclear weapons that was done in Orford Ness. So the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment built these 6 very unusual buildings called test cells, and also a thing called the impact facility. And really, once Britain had developed its own nuclear weapons, they had to be sure that these weapons would function correctly after experiencing all kinds of stresses during their transport, during the loading onto the aircraft, handling. Basically, as you can imagine, these we had to be 100% sure that nuclear weapons did not detonate until the moment that you wanted them to. So there was some very, very in-depth testing of vibration, mechanical shocks, temperature, humidity, and so on in these different laboratories to understand the effect of these different factors on the integrity and the functioning of the weapon. So initially, 3 labs were built for testing the Blue Danube bomb. This was the first nuclear weapon built by the UK. And then a few years later, another 3 laboratories were built, including also the impact facility for the WE-177, which was the 2nd generation, much smaller weapon that was built for the RAF nuclear bombers as part of the UK deterrent. And of course, each lab would require a control room, and there was also a magazine and armory. So it was quite a large number of buildings, and of course, an incredibly high security environment set up on Orford Ness to do with the testing of these weapons. So, for example, this is some images of Laboratory 1. Very curious-looking building. You can see what it looked like when it was built in 1956 and what is left of it now. Like many buildings on Orford Ness, it is left to decay naturally as part of the decision taken by the National Trust, who are looking after these sites, to just let them ruin naturally. The vibration lab was, as I said, used to test the Blue Danube bomb. There's another view of what's left of it today. So there are 2 separate rooms or test cells. It is rather hard to visualize what went on there just looking at the shell of the building and the damaged roof. It all looks very eerie, and it all looks very very sort of mysterious, and it's a bit hard sometimes to see just what it looked like. We'll come back to that in a moment. Here is the Blue Danube nuclear bomb, and here at the bottom is the Blue Danube, a drawing of the Blue Danube mounted in the vibration rig that we've published on the Irgon website. Now, this image on the bottom right there, the CGI or computer-generated image, was made by one of the Irgon team, who is something that I think is close to a magician. He has managed to make virtual drawings and also virtual videos of these buildings, and it gives you a much better idea of what these buildings look like, how they functioned. And we in Irgon are very proud to be able to use these virtual reality ways to help you understand what happened at Irgon, on Orford Ness, because the reality is that the shells of buildings that are scattered around the Ness don't really give you a very good idea of what happened. So here is a lab 2. This was a laboratory that later took on a centrifuge, built in 1957, and you can see what it looked like in 2010, some years later. In fact, the centrifuge, as you can imagine, it subjected components of the bombs to very high G forces that you might expect, for example, during impact. It also, this particular centrifuge here, was allowed the test component to be vibrated radially while experiencing very high G forces. So a very specialized piece of equipment. In fact, this particular machine still operates now in Aldeburgh, manages to reach 230 G, which is quite a frightening acceleration. But it's of course no longer located in Orford Ness. The lab 3, this is the third laboratory used for testing the Blue Danube weapon. So vibration and thermal chamber. You can see that it's heavily covered with shingle for insulation, and in the distance you can also see some other laboratories. Another view of lab 3 there, and some drawings that we have managed to obtain from the AWE. I'll mention that at the end of the talk when I go into a little bit how we do our work and what we do and who has helped us. So we come now to laboratories 4, 5, and 6. So these are the famous pagodas. These are the buildings that you see when you first arrive on Orford Ness. They're very, very weird looking, otherworldly concrete structures. You can see that they have roofs that are supported on pillars, and on top of the roof is more shingle. There are 2 identical laboratories, 4 and 5, which were used for vibration tests of the WE-177 missile. Remember, bomb rather. Sorry, remember I said that this was the 2nd generation bomb. And in fact, the reason for these rather strange structures was that although there were no nuclear weapons, as in nuclear warheads, ever present or tested on Orford Ness, so far as we know, the weapons would actually contain high explosive detonators. And these detonators would still pack quite a punch. And so if any of these had ever exploded, which of course never happened, but if it had, then the ultimate final safety device was the construction of these pagodas, where the pillars would, in the event of a blast, essentially give way, and the ceiling or the roof there would collapse onto the lower story to seal in any explosion and debris and prevent it from reaching the environment. Also, it gives you a good idea, by the way, of the shingle, of the area of shingle around that part of the Orford Ness. Well, here's a view of the WE-177 nuclear weapon mounted on this vibrator. You can see there's a thermal enclosure, a sort of insulated box that's going to be put around it so that the vibration testing will be carried out at elevated temperatures. And here is another one of RAeS special CGI drawings, in this case of the of the control center of laboratories 4 and 5. I don't actually have it working as a video in this particular presentation, but I will encourage you to have a look on the Irgon website and see some of RAeS CGI efforts. It's really quite a thing to see. Here is a view of laboratory 6, the centrifuge for testing the WE-177 missile, and you can see here the part of this circular centrifuge cavity in the floor there that held the device that you saw earlier, and Professor John Allen talking to one of the lead rangers there. Professor Allen was instrumental in testing some of the various weapons, including Blue Danube at Orford Ness. So that is the end of the first half of my presentation. So if I can find the off button, there we go. I'm now going to go and start the second one. Let's see, wish me luck. There we go. I don't know if Jenny, are you still on unmuted? Can you hear me still okay? Am I talking okay?
Yes, you're fine, Olaf. Thank you.
All right, good, fantastic. All right, here you go. All right. So, as they used to say on Monty Python, now for something completely different. This is a view of one of the smaller buildings on Orford Ness, which has actually been restored to the point where you can actually visit it, and it is not degraded like some of the other buildings, which are mostly no longer visitable by people, by tourists. But this is the bomb ballistics building, and this is in fact this was my hobby for several months, and the building, which was at the center of bomb ballistics testing for over 3 decades on Orford Ness. Doesn't look like much, but the technology that was packed into this little building in those decades is absolutely astonishing. It started out in the 30s. We see this was a time before computers, with electromechanical devices, with devices which were which gave millisecond accuracy by using vibrating tuning forks and various devices to communicate with aircraft as they released bombs and as the bombs were tracked. So this building and the role it played in bomb ballistics research is really interesting, because it also shows technology in general progressing through the decades. So this building, there's a view of it back in probably in the 40s. You can see that there's a concrete lower part, and there's a brick upper part, and there's a roof with a turret on it. And so this turret is made of armored steel, which gives you some idea of the fact that they were looking at bombs that mostly were not live, but some were. Within the building was a camera obscura, and some of you may know this as it's a device used to project a view of the outside world onto a screen. Often you see these in tourist places, camera obscura mounted on top of a building to give you a view of surrounding countryside. Well, here was a camera obscura used to track aircraft and track smoke puffs emitted by aircraft as they were doing the bombing run, to track the wind direction, which of course is one of the factors of determining the ballistics of a particular bomb as it's being dropped. It contained a ground speed camera, which was used to track the aircraft very precisely. There were various instruments in the armored turret to track the weapon as it fell, and you can actually see it today. and there's a little display inside it just of how it worked. However, the research that Irgon carried out, my little part in it, and the article published will give you a much better idea of just how it worked and what work was done there. More to the point, we are discovering new information, some documents from the National Archives have given us even more insight. So this story is developing, and it has not been told before. So on the left here, you'll see RAeS depiction of the building in a CGI. You can see that on the roof there are two openings with some little circular openings with flaps. These are the camera obscura and the ground speed camera looking up into the sky to track aircraft and the smoke puffs for wind direction. The story of bomb ballistics is, of course, different in each decade as improvements were made in the technology. And in fact, on Orford Ness, we had a system of at least 6 kinetheodolites running to track aircraft and drop weapons in real time as they fell. This was in the 1950s. If you can imagine, it's like a sort of theodolite you might use to measure the accurate angles of one point from another in azimuth and elevation. But this was a cine camera, and they used at least 2 or 3 for every particular experiment, so that you would get a 3-dimensional tracking of the aircraft or weapon as it fell. The concentration of some of the optical instruments on any one place, I think Orford Ness must hold records for the number of high-speed cameras, kinetheodolites, and all manner of other optical equipment that was used for all the experiments on the Ness. Again, this is just a little illustration of how Orford Ness was used for bomb ballistics trials. You'll see here there's a map of the Ness. You can recognize it on the colored lines are in fact bombing lines that were followed by aircraft as they carried out their bombing runs. And you can see that 3 of the lines, the red, the yellow, and the blue, meet up at a point. And this point is a bomb ballistics building. Initially, the land bombing line, the red one, was used by aircraft that would approach the building from the northeast, and they would then follow along, and they would release their bombs over the bomb ballistics building. The bomb was then the aircraft, and then the bomb were tracked, mostly photographically, but also manually by people sitting in shelters. It's not really an interesting job for me, but and these people would find the place the bomb impacted, and from the optical data would then calculate the ballistic properties of this particular weapon. Not only were they tracking bombs, but they were tracking life rafts and mines and all kinds of things dropped from aircraft. Later on, when they were looking at live weapons, they decided it was probably a wise idea not to drop them directly on the Ness in front of manned observation posts, but actually to drop them into the sea. So the sea bombing line, the light blue one, more or less from north to south, was set up. And there the aircraft would come from the north, essentially, come across the River Old there, and again drop the weapon over the bomb ballistics building, when it would then fall into the sea. But now you no longer had the luxury of finding a crater and measuring where exactly it was. So there was a system of cameras on the shore there that would follow the weapon as it splashed down into the sea, and then you would triangulate from these cameras to find out where the impact was. And then we come to the 1950s. We come to jet aircraft, cruising at 40,000 feet, and of course now the whole the land and the sea lines are just way too small to be able to be used for bomb ballistics or, for example, a nuclear weapon. And so the the Cold War bombing line came into use, and now aircraft would come in from the southwest, and they would release the weapon somewhere quite early on over Orford Ness, and the weapon would then fly, track across the bomb ballistics building and end up in the sea on the north eastern part of the yellow line there. But now you release the bomb no longer over the bomb ballistics building, but actually much further upstream. And so there was a number of additional cameras that would track the aircraft and the weapon mounted in places further along on the Ness to follow those. So you can see that very complicated and program that changed over the decades as the technology advanced. Finally, after Gary Powers was shot down in his U-2 spy plane in 1960, they realized that any operations over the Soviet Union, oops, sorry, hang on a minute. I think I just, a minute, excuse me, I just tapped the wrong way. Give me. Right. Yeah, it was no longer possible to rely on high altitude to avoid being shot down, and so a different style of releasing a nuclear weapon was developed, where the attacking aircraft would fly in at very low level under the radar, and just before release of the weapon would basically go into a steep climb. The weapon would be released in a sort of parabolic trajectory, and the aircraft would make a quick getaway. These kinds of releases were also evaluated by the bomb ballistics team on Orford Ness, and again, that was really the end of the bomb ballistic testing on Orford Ness in 1967, I think it was. So if you release a nuclear weapon and you want to make a getaway, but you release it at a very low level, you don't really have enough time. If it was set to detonate as soon as it approached the target, you don't have enough time to get away before the thing explodes. So in fact, these were equipped with the time delay, which meant that if the weapon impacted on a hard surface, it still had to detonate without being destroyed, and that therefore gave rise to another way of testing these missiles called the impact facility, or hard target, where literally bombs or bomb casings were fired into concrete walls at different angles, at different speeds, to see if they would still detonate correctly after surviving this kind of an impact. There are some really incredibly interesting high-speed cameras we used, which were, world-class at the time. Obviously, not much is left of the facility now, but at the time it was unique. And again, on the Irgon website, you can find much more information about that particular testing. Unfortunately, I can't show you the CGI video with the iPad technology, but it is available on our website. Please have a look. Here's a still showing you the weapon on a cradle that was accelerated towards the target. There was then a rocket to slow down the trolley, and the bomb continued on its way and smashed into the wall. Over the horizon radar is another activity that was carried out by teams on Orford Ness. You can see there Orford Ness on the left, and there are there are two ways of detecting an object that is not visible directly, that is actually over the horizon. And you're really relying on the ionosphere as a way to reflect signals. In the case of the one system called backscatter, it's really an active system where there's a radar pulse emitted from Orford Ness in this case. It reflects off the ionosphere several times. It reflects off whatever you're trying to detect, whether it's an aircraft or a missile. And then what comes back, the returning signal, is what you analyze. There were 3 of these built on Orford Ness. One was in Building 84, which in fact was used to detect the unannounced French nuclear tests that were carried out in Algeria in 1959 and 1960. Another system called Chaplin, which I will mention a little bit later, for detection of nuclear tests over the USSR in 1965 to 69, and finally Cobra Mist, which was only operational for a couple of years to try and detect aircraft and missiles, again, of the USSR. Let me skip the next slide, or go very briefly. This basically illustrates the alternative way of measuring, of detecting an object in the sky, which is called forward scatter. And there you are basically emitting a signal from one end and receiving it halfway around the world or even further. And you're looking at the difference in the signal between the emission and the reception to give you some information about anything that's in between there, be it a missile or an aircraft or whatever. But this kind of a radar was never used on Orford Ness. So I'll just skip that if I may. All right, yeah, quickly going through. This is Building 84, what's left of it. That was, in fact, the control center of the efforts to detect the French nuclear tests, called Gerboise Bleu, which took place in Irgon, in the middle of the desert. This is all that remains of a radar setup called Chaplin, also called Pound Note. This is a very interesting story. Come back to that in a moment. The 50-meter concrete ring was the only remnant on Orford Ness of this particular instrument. It was not known what it was. Various theories existed, some more believable than others. It was only through interviewing some people who had actually lived, who had actually worked there, and some further information that Irgon was able to figure out what it looked like. So, as it says here, we found a photograph showing this thing in the background. We got some drawings from the atomic weapons establishment, and of course, we talked to a couple of staff that described it being built. We think this is what it looked like. Now, nobody knew about this before it was published by Irgon. So we see here a rotatable helical array mounted on this particular concrete ring. This could be swiveled around 360 degrees. You had these 2 very large mesh reflectors, which you can see, one on the top of the image and one just in the foreground. And you see the monopoles on both sides, which are the actual receivers, of the signal, and a couple of caravans that supplied that was used to control this huge array. You think about, look at the size of the bomb ballistics building, which I showed you earlier in the foreground there with the little Land Rover. So yeah, this massive device, and all that's left now is a concrete ring. There was also a device to test the telemetry aerials inside a nose cone of a missile. So you have to imagine this is a device where the communication with aerials in the nose cone was achieved, and the nose cone was mounted, could be rotated and tilted in all directions. It was a wooden structure so that it didn't interfere with the signal. Basically, this was another example of the testing of components of in this case, a nuclear missile carried out at Orford Ness. So this very brief look at some of the programs up on Orford Ness gives you some idea not only of what was done there, but as we mentioned earlier, it was all secret. And so it is incredibly hard to get information. Even though it may be declassified now, there may not be people around anymore. It's difficult to get information. We need to collate it. We need to find it and piece together. But it's a lot of, it's very rewarding to be able to piece together a history which we think needs to be told. And if we don't tell it, in 10 years' time, there may be nobody around to tell this anymore. So Irgon, what we try to do is to gather as much information as possible from any source we can, and to put that information on the public domain, typically via our website. That's what we want to do. Get it out there, and then people might come back and say, oh, I know about this. My father worked there. I have some pictures. Wouldn't that be nice? And also to use these computer-generated images to offer the public a much better idea of what it was like on Orford Ness, rather than looking at some of the buildings which are not particularly well anymore. So, for example, well, you already saw the CGI imagery of the Chaplin over-the-horizon radar. I'll let you look at some of the other CGI images and videos on our website. But let me go on to the Orford Ness veterans. So these are people who worked on Orford Ness, most of whom, of course, have now long retired or passed on. But the environment of secrecy that pervaded the work on Orford Ness led to these people really being sort of unsung heroes, and in many ways doing work that was never recognized, was never really valued, and was never told. So one of the first things that Irgon did, or more to the point that David Warren, between 2013 and 2017, was to interview Orford Ness veterans. So he interviewed about 60 people. He can probably tell you more if you're interested, and really to try and get their stories before it was too late. So we have people who've had memories of some things they did 55 years ago. Personally, I spoke with a couple of people who literally in the 1950s worked on Orford Ness, and they can remember things when they were 18, which is certainly more than I can. So we had some astonishing feedback from some of these veterans. These are some of the programs that have been possible for Irgon because of interviews from veterans. I already mentioned Chaplin, the 50-meter ring over horizon radar, and the gantry for the blue streak telemetry experiments. The model ballistics firing range I haven't even touched on. We just will cover it some other time, and the bomb ballistics building. Here are some of the veterans from back then. Orford Ness had a well, David will be able to tell you more than I can, but there must have been a fairly vibrant sort of social activities. They had a cricket team, they played badminton, people went swimming in the sea in their lunch break. We were reliably informed that the Orford Ness cricket team never played at home for obvious reasons, but these people are the heroes of the time, and so I think they are also a reason why we need to keep those stories alive. These people actually did it. Here is another image of some images of people working on Orford Ness, of the technical staff, other parties they were having, always with this caveat that you never talk about work. Here is a really cool story of how we managed to figure out the structure of the chaplain over the horizon radar. David spoke with two people about their memories of this particular instrument, and Colin had made a sketch, or we made a sketch of when Colin tried to describe to us the shape that he remembers the thing being on the 50-meter ring. You can see they made the big circle on the bottom there. So this is the features of the radar that he remembers from his time in the early 60s. Mike was a little bit later, and his memory was slightly different. He remembers the large upright circular transmitter, but in fact, the truth, as you can see from the drawing there, is the combination of the two, and we would not have been able to put this together without the help of these veterans. We did have some. A minute, is it the next? No. We did have some help from the Atomic Weapons Establishment. They supplied us with a large number of drawings, which we are going through painstakingly at the moment, drawings of sites of buildings. We are a very small group, and so whenever we talk to people outside, talk to visitors, our questions are the same. Did you work on any of these Orford Ness trials, or do you know anybody who did? Would you like to take on a project with Irgon to help us process some of this information, get it published, and let the rest of the world know what happened there? Just as an example, so for my little self, the program I covered on the history of the bomb ballistics program, I did it all remotely. David sent me some information and reports and pictures. We had some further information from the National Archives and some online, and I pieced together the story. So I didn't have to actually be there on the nest myself. And if anybody is interested in getting more involved in some of the amazing things that went on there, there's plenty to do, and there's plenty to get stuck in. So, well, visit Orford Ness, please. I know it's a long way from where you are now, but here are the opening times this year. You need to use the National Trust site to book trips, but there are trips available, individuals and tour guides on trailer, for example. Orford Ness is so many things. There is much to see and photograph in the so far as the nature is concerned, but also on the military side, there's a lot going on, and we'd love people interested to come and see it for themselves. So far as trips are concerned, you can see that the jetty on the bottom left of the salt marsh part of the Ness, that's where all tours start. That's where the ferry from Orford lands, and there are three different routes. There's the red route, green route, and blue route, and they are open at different times depending mainly on when birds breed. The total length of tracks is about 6 miles, so there's certainly plenty to see and plenty to do. Orford Ness is certainly a good way to stretch your legs. It's a much bigger site than it seems at first. Some information about Orford Ness. Well, there's two very important books. There's Most Secret, The Hidden History of Orford Ness by Paddy Hazel. If you get this book, you will get a very good background of what happened on Orford Ness. There's others like Secret Site by Gordon Kinsey. There's our website where we have many, many links to other military heritage websites. Please visit us, contact us directly if you think that other links should be added. And with that, I thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you about Orford Ness, for your patience and listening. And I'm going to ask if there are any questions. I will now unshare this particular presentation and